I'm not going to show you how you can really simply grow leaves on trees for animation. This technique is just a very quick setup, and I've already rendered this out, just kind of a smaller animation. It's about 3 seconds long, and I'm just going to scrub through to show it. So just over time, you can just see the clones just kind of changing in size, and I do have some other motion in there as well. I do have a little bit of the wind system built in using the turbulence to modify some of the banking and pitch. So overall, just pretty simple animation. And I'll go ahead and include that in DivX format so you can take a look at the video and see it in full motion. I do want to note that the early frames that you'll see up at the upper right corner, I'm just going to start to scrub through a little. You're going to see a lot of flickering, and that is caused by the low polygon amount used on these leaves. This is the cluster used earlier in the training, the leaf cluster. So very low polygon. Once they get a little larger, it's not a big deal because the shading isn't changing very often. But when they're very small, there's a bit of immediate flicker, at least in that area where the light is just coming through on the angle. In the animation, it really isn't that noticeable. The only way to get rid of it, or the easiest way to get rid of it, would just be to add that leaf to a hyperNURBS object, and just even subdividing it once would be more than enough. So overall, the animation was rendered very quickly. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the layers so we can take a look at the frames. It's only rendered 640 by 480, and total render time was 15 minutes for the entire animation, so 18 seconds per frame. That's pretty good overall. I did anti-aliasing of 2x2 by 4x4, 2x2 being the min and 4 being the max. And then I have a vector blur set up on the tree and on the leaves. So just a very quick way to blur the entire scene without having to use the scene blur. So if we take a look at the scene, I do have a display tag limiter limiting the amount of leaves showing. But you could just take a look and see a small portion of the leaves showing within the viewport. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the scene setup and how this can be achieved. So first thing I'm going to do is go back to the version with just the tree, no animation, or any of that setup. So this is the leaves generator tree scene. Just the tree with the leaves on it, no motion, and no effectors. So it is just the generator, which is just the MoGraph cloner object assigned to the branch tips, and with a lower preview for the look of the leaf textures. And I want to make a quick note about the material. The leaves we're using, we have that color variation set up. And depending on whether or not the noise is set to, in this case we have it on object, which is the way it needs to be set up. If you're using a world coordinate, you are going to need to change it to prevent the leaf from growing through the color change. We would want that to stay fixed on the object as it grows. So that's one important thing to keep in mind when you have these global changes for material shaders. So what I decided to do for the animation I thought would be easier is just to use the XREF to animate the clone. Now there's a lot of different ways to animate these clones, and we could use a direct keyframe animation, which is one way. If we go into the generator object in the attributes, the transform, we can animate that over time. So one way to achieve this really easily would just be to create a keyframe. Let's go ahead and just do this really quick. Setting up a keyframe for the size on the X, Y, and Z, and let's go ahead and start at 0. And then with all of these selected, right-click animation, add keyframe, or you could use keyboard shortcut for that. I'm just going to use the right-click for now. And let's go up to about 60 frames in, and then set that to 0.12. And then we can control-click on the little light that was yellow, showing that it wasn't keyed but changed, and then red, showing that there is a keyframe. So now we just have a very direct animation of all of these clones, starting from 0 and up to frame 60, and then after that there is no more scaling. So that's a quick way to do the growth. I set it up a little bit different because I wanted to be able to have some variation within the individual clones in their size. Basically, sort of kind of a spawn time. And I did have to use a duplicate generator for that with the time offset, and we'll take a look at that in a minute here. So what I'm going to do is clear out these keyframes. First, if you want, just take a look at the animation again. You can see it's just a very basic animation. We could also animate pitch and other settings like that. And then if we wanted to set up the leaf's turbulence, which is going to work out best, actually, before I clear out the animation, we can set up first that wind system, which is also going to end up being used for the XREF object. So for the wind turbulence, what we can use is the random effector. And then under the attributes for the random effector, we are going to enable rotation. And we just want to set up, let's go ahead and do 15 and negative 15. So pitch and bank, pitch being 15, bank being negative 15. Going over to, under effector, the random mode, we're going to set this to turbulence. Turbulence is more of an ease in and out type motion rather than noise, which is a continuous type of motion. Turbulence works a lot better for leaf motion. Animation speed, I'm going to go ahead and turn down to 5. It wasn't very noticeable with the setting of 5 in my animation, so depending on the length, and you might need to exaggerate it a little in order to really get it to show up. So let's go ahead and maybe bring it up to 15. And then we'll see that little bit of motion. Now, we're going to see more of a fluid type motion through all of the clones with this mode without the indexed and synchronized turned on. So with those options turned off, we have the turbulence running through all of the clones as kind of a whole object. Changing the transformation space, we'll modify that slightly, going from node to effector. And then we can modify the scale. And then the intensity is basically the overall pitch amount. So if we do 30 and negative 30, we're going to see a lot more motion going on. We could change the space to UV, which is going to give us a different type of motion. We don't really have a lot of frames with it at full size, so it's harder to see the overall effect. But now if I turn it over to indexed, we're going to see a slightly different output. Mostly it's when we set it to synchronized that we're going to see more frequent changes within the object, but overall it does work out pretty well. Synchronize also will give you a quicker increase in response time for the scene, allowing you to preview things much quicker. You can also choose to set up a duplicate wind system for fluttering, maybe with a different scale, and just kind of mix together different random turbulence at different scales and at different overall pitch, bank, even heading a little, in order to create as much realism as possible and as much variation. The minimum and maximum controls of this also allow some nice variation and can also be keyframed. So if we wanted the leaves to all kind of shift in a certain direction, we could use the minimum and maximum amounts, and still having the animated turbulence, we can add more of a wind, a large gust of wind that would affect all of the leaves and kind of send them into a different direction. So you can also keyframe the minimum and maximum values for a little bit more. Even the strength setting, if you wanted to have some still areas within the animation. So parts where there's almost no movement whatsoever. And once again, having separate effectors allows even more options for this. Now, because I already have this keyframed, and it's basically turning out to be about the same as what I had for the previous scene, we are going to still go back to the XREF, because the options I used for that are a little different than what's I'm showing right now, and it gives you really more control if you have some of the additional add-ons for cinema. If you don't have any other add-ons other than MoGraph, then you really don't need to have a separate scene. Just keyframing the overall scale of the generator and the transform is more than enough. So let's go ahead and create that duplicate to create an offset for the animation. And what I want to do is reduce the count to 4,000, so being half of what it currently was. And I'm going to copy and paste the generator and just have a duplicate with the same amount. So then we still have 4,000 plus 4,000, so we still have 8,000 clones. And in order to make sure they're not showing in exactly the same place, because otherwise they're just going to be overlapping, what we can do is change the seed value, which is kind of based on an internal noise that populates it over the surface. Even a slight change to the seed will typically be more than enough. What we can do is go ahead and delete the last 0 and change the seed, the first from the 1 to a 2, and now we'll have a different population. And still with the animation carried over. So we have the keyframes that we can see for the transform within the timeline on the bottom. And we really don't need to do anything except directly offset these keyframes. So we can grab the one at 60 and maybe bring it up a little bit higher, and take the first one, which is at frame 0, and just drag that up to about frame 20 or so, just around frame 20. So I've actually got it on frame 19. So this way we have 2 separate growth clones, and that way not everything is just popping up at the same time. There is a little bit of variation. Because this tree has multiple tags available for the selection, and what I'm going to do is select the generator, go to the object, and right now we have the twig set for both of them. Well, what I can do is use the original generator, the one that starts first in the animation, and change that to a different tag, which is going to be basically I could use the entire branch. So instead of just using the twig, I'll use the branch. And this way, it's going to give us more of a growth that's expanding, because the twigs will have a delayed motion, so we'll start from sort of the center and work our way outward. So if we take a look at that sort of growth, it does look a little bit better and a little more varied. And it does fill the tree in a lot more by populating on the branches along with the twig, which is more of the end portions. If we go back to the cloner attached to the twig selection, what I want to do is offset even further. So let's go ahead and start at 30 and end around 90. So then we're going to see the twig area is not even growing until much later, which does give us more of a central to outward type animation. Which is pretty neat. And I'm going to go ahead and change that secondary later growth up to 6,000 clones. So you're having even more showing up on the outside. We can go ahead and take a look at an animation. And now because the branch and the twigs are very close to each other, it's not going to be perfect. And if we take a look, we might even just need to update and refresh the other cloner. So what I am going to do is go to the first cloner object and just change the seed and then change it back and do the same thing for the other set of clones. Because sometimes you do need to kind of update it, but it does look like it did need to be updated, because now I see a lot more growth on the branches and then the twigs coming in. So in that case, it is a good idea to update the seed or the count, anything that's going to refresh, and basically in this case to the new selection tag, because there was a new selection tag added. Before, we definitely did not have this much variation on the branch. So what I'm also going to do is go to the branch and turn that down to 2,000, because I do want to have more on the twigs, which was the original selection. So I could even reduce that further and have more on the twigs to create a slightly better animation. So starting from the center and then coming out on the twigs. It doesn't look too bad. So this animation is would be basically finished if we were happy with just this sort of a setup. Probably would go ahead and reduce the branch amount and increase the twig surface. So let's take the branch down to 1,000 and take the twig value up to 7,000. So still keeping with the same amount of clones overall, with being 8,000. I could still give or take a few, maybe add some more. Let's reduce that. So now there's only 1,000 that are going to grow on the branches immediately, and then a lot more growing on the twigs later. So I'm going to edit the scene now and remove the duplicate clone, or cloner object, and then bring the other count back to its original state. Or I'm going to wait because I do have to, of course, make other modifications to the scene. So just removing the other cloner and then going into the keyframes for the size changes of the other cloner and just deleting those keyframes. I did delete the cloner by accident, so making sure that we just edit the keyframes. And then I also need to go back and set that selection back to the twig selection. And then refresh the count. I will end up changing that back, but just for now we're going to keep it a lower amount to improve the scene speed. And we're going to take a look now at animating the individual clones rather than the cloner. So this would be also using XREF object. So first I'm going to go ahead and save this out as the clone animation. So it's going to be a little different. And what we're going to do is select the object, so the clone, which is our leaf cluster. And just for now, I'm going to move the material onto this object so that we can see it while we're modifying and editing it. I'm going to copy, so in the model mode, copy this, Control N, so Control C to copy, and then Control N for a new scene, Control V to paste it. Now, because we're in a new scene, and we can modify scene scales independently, since this is very small compared to the rest of the scene, what I can do is just scale this up, make it a lot larger, so that while we're editing it, it becomes a lot easier to work with. Another thing we want to do is reset the coordinates for this object. So we can just go into the attributes, the coordinates, and set to 0, because otherwise the scene itself becomes the pivot. And unless we have the object pivot set to the center, it's going to be offset from basically the start position or the connecting position onto the branches. In the material editor, I'm just going to increase the preview size so that we can see that a little bit better. Turn on my enhanced OpenGL, and then we can see the material and the object a little bit better. So what we could do is set up a keyframe animation. What I'm going to do is set a 2-second animation, so it's going to be 60 frames long, because I am working with 30 frames per second. And I'm going to go ahead and save the scene out. And it's really important that you also save anything you're going to be using for XREF within the same directory. So you do want to make sure they are in the same folder. And I'm just going to call this clone animation leaf cluster. Or actually, I'll call it leaf cluster _ clone animation. And now what we can do is modify and deform this basically however we want to create our growth and apply that to our cloners. So one of the easiest things we can do is to modify just the scale directly. Since I have my starting scale basically already, and we're going to switch over to the object mode, it's also going to be dependent because the way scaling works and the way keyframing, first we'll go ahead to the last frame, 60, create a keyframe. And now if I go back to the beginning and size down the model and create a keyframe, it's going to stay exactly the same because we need to animate the object mode. Model is independent from that, so we can go through and even size this down after we're done with any animation we have. So right now there's basically no animation. So model does work independently, which is pretty nice. So if we go to the object mode, now we can scale this down, create the keyframe, and we just have a scale. So this direct scaling, it could be somewhat useful, but for the most part, it's not going to create the best look. There's also a few restrictions on what's going to end up being carried over to the other scene as far as modifying the object scales because of the way different effectors work and also because of the way the clone works, or the cloner object. But what I found I liked was starting with sort of a negative Y scale and then working my way down. So if we go back to the start frame, and actually what I think I'm going to do is do all my modifications, and this is what I ended up doing for the scene I was showing that was rendered out. Start out with something larger and just do that final scale at the end, and that way you don't have to keep zooming in and out of the scene and getting to a point where it's such a small clone or object it's hard to work with. So starting with this rotation, keyframing that, and then it'll just kind of flip inside out and go down if that animation's carried over. It really depends how quickly the change is, because it also has to do with the size in the scene, and when it reaches a point where you can really see it, is it already folded over. So what I may have to do is take this keyframe. Actually, what I'm going to do is just delete the current one because I don't want to mess up the scale again. And I'm going to do that invert, so this is just an independent keyframe. That way I just don't have to go in because it's to the other settings for the timeline and mess with it, because I don't even need the scale right now. So I'm going to set that to frame 30, about halfway before that motion takes place. And then I can set it a little bit higher, create a keyframe, and drag that to about frame 15. So now we can also modify and create morph targets. So if you have access to Mocha, and you have the character menu, which also has the options to add in our morph targets, but we're going to be using tags. But we can use the morph deformer point cache objects. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and go to character tags and select what's going to be our morph. And to create the morph, I'm going to go to the last frame, which is basically the unedited object. So we could, this is our morph, or our base morph. And what we want to do is make our start frame set up a little bit differently. So actually I'm going to go to the first frame and create a morph target. So what we do is go to the points mode and select the points we want to edit, keeping in mind the scaling. If you want to undo the scaling, and what we can do is basically either remove the other keyframes, but it's better just to select the keyframe and under the attributes select mute for both of those central keyframes that modify the scale. And we should be able to get that to reset. So once we go back to frame 60, and it shows frame 60, that becomes the new primary. So since those are muted. So let's go into the points. And just select the outer edge. Actually, a faster way to do that would be the one of the loop selection modes, or selecting the outside with maybe the edges. Might be a little bit easier. But what I want to do is reduce the scale of these points. And we can move them down. And then also take these top two, scale them on the X inward, and then bring it in on the Z. And we're just kind of crumpling it a little. I'm just grabbing these different points. We may end up modifying the object axis slightly, but it shouldn't be too large of an impact. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab these inside points and fold that a little more. And go around the sides. And scale that in. And then we go to our morph target, which is, since the first morph target is already basically assigned and created for us, we can now switch back and forth between the base morph and the morph target. So this way we can set up our animation. And we can do this a couple of different ways. We can modify the tag in the animate mode. Or what we can do is use the morph deformer object as a child. And our morph tag is already applied. And we can go beyond to add a little bit of additional morph. So I am going to use the morph deformer. And what we're going to do is start with a value of 100%. And we can add a keyframe. And then at frame 60, set it to 0. So that's going to morph over time. And then we're going to go back to those other keyframes. An additional nice thing about modifying with the morph deformer as opposed to the tag is you should be able to hide those other keyframes from the timeline. Just in this small timeline, it makes it a little bit easier to separate everything. So I'm going to go into these other keyframes and turn off the mute option. And we can see the motion. Now we do need to set up the scaling. At least the overall scaling. And there might be an impact with the other keyframes. So whether or not I have to redo it in order to get the size right, we'll have to see. So in the object mode, we're going to grab the leaf cluster, and we are going to scale this down very small and create a keyframe. It might jump up full size and then go back down, and that's because of those other keyframes. So we can go to them, to those keyframes, and just modify the scale to be the correct percentage if we want the scaling over time to be consistent. But I think it's just going to be easier just to delete those keyframes and instead remake them. So we already have it with that deformation stretched upward to start, but I am going to go into frame 30 and pull that back more to the negative, create a keyframe. And then we're going to have the cloner object handle any sort of rotation and pitch. Because of the way the clones are aligned with the cloner object, that information from the animation may not carry over. So that's important to keep in mind whenever you have any rotation within the object. Also keep in mind at what size we're going to see it when it comes into frame, because it is going to be very small to start, and then expand open. So if we're not seeing enough of the animation and the flexibility of it, we may need to adjust keyframes to see that a little better, because right now it's very linear. So I'm going to go back frame 30 and just stretch that out a little more, negative scaling. So now we have an animation we can use as an XREF object. And if we need to modify that starting point to the morph, we can go through and edit that. So going to the edit mode, selecting the morph target, which looks like it's rather changed than what it looked like before. What I'm going to do is grab these top points and just move them in and scale them. I'm just kind of making it fold into itself. So that did change the morph slightly, but it's still on edit mode, so going back to the tag and turning it to animate mode. Now, because of the low polygon amount, we're having some kind of weird stuff happen here. I do need to turn the morph target down, and that was probably the cause. Because otherwise, if we don't have enough time or enough changes, basically additional morph targets, in between the animation, what's going to happen is the points are just going to go through itself, as you can see. And that's partially because of the scaling, but also because of the morph target. So let's turn that down so that we're just working with the overall morph target amount. And now we've got that crumpled beginning where it's just kind of very tightly condensed, and then it expands. So if we also need that extra bit of detail to remove that flicker, depending on how many of these you're going to have in the scene and how long it's going to take for it to grow, what we need is more geometry. So we can just use a division of 1, which might be more than enough. The only problem is looks like it's a little reversed because of the way the NURBs are set up in the orientation. So we may have to set that up a little bit differently, because it is giving me an entirely different look to the object once I add it to the HyperNURBs. And it has gone around and kind of flipped it on me. So we might just be able to rotate that around. That's not really a big deal. I am going to, I think, modify the object axis because it's not in the right place anymore. So that does look a little better. We can also use the cloner just to modify the rotation if needed. But it looks like because of the scale changes, kind of going inside out, which may not be the best way to always animate things, I might just need to kind of rotate this around. So I'm just going to grab the HyperNURBs object and rotate that. So now we're back to where we were before. So we'll rename this a leaf cluster animate and save out the scene. And this is the scene I had used for my other animation, and I just animated the morph target rather than using the morph deformer. And I think that may have caused some problems with the way it looked. Obviously the texture isn't on here. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And going back to the scene leaf cluster that we just worked on, we also now want to remove that texture tag. And then we can go ahead and save the scene and then switch over to the main scene. And I'm going to take the material that we had moved over onto the leaf cluster and move it back onto the generator. And then just take this object and move it out of the cloner. And I'm going to hide it from the render and from the scene. So now what we're going to do is go to Object at the top, under Scene, and add the XREF object. File name, go ahead and choose the project, the leaf cluster clone animation. Go ahead and open that. And we'll go ahead and move the camera. And if we take a look, now scrubbing through the timeline, we're not really going to see anything because we do need to use the Take animation button. Go ahead and click that. And now we're going to see the object animated. It looks like there might be a glitch. I'll have to take a look. It might just be folding through the ground plane very quickly, which it looks like it is. So it looks like it will be okay, and we can add this now to the generator. And we're automatically going to see that motion. Of course, the scaling is different, so we can either go into back into the other scene, which is still open and will refresh automatically. If not, you can reload the scene. And then we can use that model mode to scale it down. But what I want to do is use the matrix and just modify the scale. Or we can just go into the generator and transform scale that way. But in case I do want to make additional changes, maybe animate this scale separately, I'm going to choose just reduce the pivot matrix scale. So I'm going to use 0.2. And it looks like it's not allowing me to enter in the 0.2 value. And it is setting it to 0. I'll have to take a look and see if that's a problem with me recording the screen at this time. I did try to change the attributes. It looks like I've hit a little bit, possibly of a bug. So that's rather interesting. I haven't seen that before. So I'm going to delete that and just reload that object and the scene. And instead of using the pivot matrix, just modify the cloner. Because that is something I really don't want to modify too much there. So we'll go into a cloner object after adding the XREF to our scene and the cloner. And now selecting the generator under transform, just modify the scale. Or like I was saying before, we can go back to the original scene. It does look like it is retaining keyframes from before. So I'm going to delete the track. We can just select right click, animation delete track, and go ahead and modify it from there. So now I have a very small value, 0.02. That's a lot of transformation. But we can go back to the original scene if needed. It looks like pretty much everything carried over correctly. The only thing that looks a little weird is what's happening at that fold point, where it is kind of, I think, inverting too much compared to the way the morph target is. So I'm going to go back to the other scene. And although it's pretty fluid in this scene, it might just be the level of detail in the way that's showing. We'll have to take a look. So I think what I'm going to end up doing is going to the object and adjusting that scale so that it's not so intense, creating the keyframe, going to frame 30, and just going ahead and removing that frame at 30. So actually we just want to modify maybe the scale. And see if that takes care of it. Go ahead and save that out. Go over to the other scene. And it looks like the points are folding in and out, which is causing a problem with the shader, the specular values. And what I may need to just end up doing is going back into the deformer and changing the morph target. It looks like it's this point and these top points that I ended up bringing in towards the end. So we're going to go to the morph, select edit mode, select the morph target, and just kind of pull that stuff and those points out. It does look a little strange because of the other object, but I'm just going to work on kind of fixing, and it may be because it's kind of folded out. I'll just go ahead and make some changes, and we'll be able to see. So going back and changing this now to the animate mode. We'll see how that's going to work. Go ahead and save this out. And I'm also going to just make sure and reload the scene. So it looks like I have basically a point passing through the object, which is messing up the look of it. And it might do with just the Phong angle, but it looks like it has another problem with it besides that. So that's really kind of strange. Whether or not it'll show in the animation, it probably will. But it looks like it might just be a Phong tag. So what I'm going to do is go to the tag and turn off the angle limit and see how that works. It might also be due to the HyperNerbs object. So there's a lot of possible variations for this. I'm going to go ahead and first taking and removing the bank setting on the hypernerbs, pulling out the cluster, deleting the hypernerbs, saving the scene, and then going back to the xref, reloading the scene. And we can tell that that's not the issue. And the problem is when you scrub through quickly, you really can't see it. But when you are playing back the animation, it does show. And it's really only one frame that's the problem. So I can go back and edit that to get it to work. So basically it's just a matter of maybe going back and redoing the morph targets and being a little more careful about it, making sure there's no folding, also the scaling. But I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we can take a look at some of the additional features we can do with this animation now that it is an animated clone rather than just animating the cloner object. So we have an additional option which really speeds things up. Since the animation's already created, what we can do is use the time under transform to set up an offset. So if I want to offset the animation by 15 frames, it's now not going to start until frame 15. And that's what's set to the play mode. We can also set it to a loop mode, so it's just going to replay it over and over again within the length of the scene, the xref scene animation. If we set it to fixed, it's going to stay on the fixed frame of whatever frame we type in. So frame 60 is the end, and if we want the scale and the animation to stay fixed at that frame, you can type it in. Fixed loop is going to, let's go ahead and set in a value it's going to show. We'll do frame 15. Well, in this case, it's really not going to be something that's going to be all that visible with this setup. But using the play mode, we can now very quickly just offset the entire animation, and then once it's done, it'll stop the animation. But since we have the random effector set up for the wind, it'll continue to manipulate and move the clones, which is really quite nice. And doing just what I set up before, I'm going to copy and paste the cloner object and set up a different count, or first changing the seed, and then under transform we can set up a little bit of an offset. So now there's two separate animations playing, just avoiding that annoying flicker that's happening because of the inside-out clones. And then what you could really do is just create several duplicate cloners in order to step up the animation, in order to offset them and have even more variation. Or go back into the other object or the scene and create different leaves animated different times. Really a lot you can do with it that way. Unfortunately, the spawning of the amount of clones the animation is fixed, at least when you're rendering instances. So even if we changed over time the count to have more appearing, the start frame of the animation remains the same for all clones. So in other words, they'll be popping up halfway during the animation or appearing on the object. The only way to get around that is to use thinking particles. So if you don't have the thinking particles add-on or module, then that effect is really going to have to be achieved by creating duplicate cloner objects or using more animation within the XREF object or whatever object. So you don't have to use the XREF. You can also just copy that object in from the other scene and paste it into this one. Since it's not a very complex scene, that could be very easily achieved. The one nice thing is, since you could just change the materials over and over again, you really don't need to create additional animations for other types of leaves. You could really just use the same object and just swap out the material. Okay, I just want to show really quickly the render settings and the setup I did for this scene, and some really important factors when network rendering or using certain effectors. The first thing we're just going to really quickly set up is the motion blur. And I choose to use the vector motion blur because it's very quick, and instead of using a full scene motion blur. And I did, in my animation, just had the camera kind of moving around the object a little. So just slightly moving around the tree. So very minimal amount of motion blur. But in order to set that up, what we can do is go to each of the cloner objects, right-click, C4D tag, and add in motion blur. And then, because the tree was also blurred, and we also want the tree to have motion blur, we can just go to the tree object and add the motion blur tag to the hyperNURBS. Because I didn't see the ground in my animation, I didn't need to blur it, and the sky is just a simple gradient, so that didn't really need to be blurred either. If you do have the ground showing, any other objects would also need the motion blur tag. So then in the render settings, you also want to set up, under Effects, Vector Motion Blur, where I just went ahead and changed the settings a little. And I decided just to use a smaller sample count, brought it down to 32. And then anti-aliasing, 2x2, 4x4 was sufficient, and setting the filter to animation. Other than that, it's pretty much set up, besides changing the output to whatever frame size you want, and then setting the save option to save frames. I just saved everything out as TGA files. And the TGA is the Targa format. Now for setting up, whenever you're going to be animating any of the clones or rendering on a network, you need to set up the MoGraph cache tags. If you're just rendering on a single system and you haven't used any delay deformers or time, or basically a time effector or delay effectors, then you may not need to cache the MoGraph clones, but I usually like to do it just in case. Whenever you're using a network render, so the net render module, it's an absolute must. So in order to cache the clones, what we need to do is right-click on any of the cloner objects and go to MoGraph tag and select the MoGraph cache. And what we're going to do is bake the sequence from 0 to 90, so the full animation. And then we're going to bake it. And that's 16 megs of memory it's using for that. And then we're going to add in another tag, the MoGraph cache, to the other cloner object. Bake sequence, 0 to 90. And then we can bake that. At this point, with them baked, you can also swap out the objects. What is being stored is the position and any effectors that are applied. So it's also a good idea to turn off effectors you have in the scene so that they're not applying any additional animation, because you can use the effectors to modify any cached MoGraph clones. So now the motion is baked and in the cache, and the scene response will also be a lot faster at this point because it doesn't need to calculate where anything is going to go. An advantage of using this on a single system where you typically would need to cache it is it will render faster because it doesn't need to make any calculations. More so when you have any sort of rigid body dynamics or any collisions which are available with MoGraph using the rigid body tag. So that is all the interactive types of animation that are available. So after adding the cache, and once it's green, as you can see, the tag, that means it is ready to go. Everything is cached, all the motion that is being seen applied. You can then render out the animation. And I just want to make one last note about using the XREF. If you decided to use an animated sequence on the polygon, so taking the animation of growth, relief, and putting that on the leaves in a different file, that animation may not work with the XREF, and it might just show the same frame over and over. So that is one thing to keep in mind.